The invoice was for $275. Paige Dunmore read the line items without looking up. Acoustic resonance assessment, Sector C columns, Burlington Meridian Center, 4 hours. And then she set it face down on her desk and told Mitch Callender that he had no standing to file a safety concern report but provincial infrastructure partner project site, that his methodology was not recognized by the provincial licensing body, by provincial, and that the building supervisor who had let him in had done so without authorization. Mitch Callender was 49 years old, with the kind of stillness that comes not from temperament alone, but from a decade and a half of working in places where a wrong movement could mean a wrong reading. He had been inside a lot of buildings that looked fine from the outside. He had learned early that concrete does not announce its failures in advance. He listened to Paige Dunmore until she was finished. Then he said that the columns in Sector C would fail under combined December load and freeze-thaw stress if the delamination he had identified was not addressed before winter, and that he had filed the safety concern report with the Ministry of Transportation Ontario because he was required by his professional certification to do exactly that when he identified a material structural risk, regardless of whose name was on the permit. Paige told him that her company's licensed engineering team had inspected and cleared the Meridian Center for years prior, and that his unsanctioned second opinion carried no regulatory weight against a signed certification from engineers of record. She told him the ministry would likely dismiss the report. She told him the $275 invoice would not be honored, and that he should expect to receive a letter from Dunmore's legal team regarding unauthorized site access. Mitch did not respond to the last item. He picked up his copy of the invoice, folded it once, and placed it in the chest pocket of his jacket. He said, on his way to the door, that the report was already filed, and the ministry was already aware of the specific failure mode and the timeline. He was not saying it as a threat. He was saying it states a fact that has already moved beyond the point where stating it changes anything. He drove back to Hamilton on the 403 with the radio off. The office he kept above a printing supply company on Barton Street East was small enough that he could hear his printer from the front door, and the filing system along one wall represented 15 years of inspection reports, none of which had ever been successfully challenged in a regulatory proceeding. He had built the practice slowly, after the years when building it slowly was the only option available to him. He had a part-time office manager who came in 3 days a week, a small fleet of acoustic probes he had designed himself, and a daughter named Bree, who was 17 and knew the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition because she had grown up hearing about them. His wife, Yvonne, had died of complications following surgery 6 years earlier. She had made it to 43. Bree had been 11, and Mitch had told himself the things a person tells themselves at that point about focus and purpose and what children need from the one parent they have left. He had told himself these things until they became less a comfort and more a structure, like the walls of the practice he had built to hold the work that kept him from thinking too hard about how quiet the house had become. He did not think about what might happen to the practice now, because he had learned a long time ago not to do that on the drive home. Walter Dunmore was not supposed to be reviewing ministry correspondence at 7:45 in the evening. His cardiologist had been specific about reducing decision load after 6 p.m., and his daughter had been equally specific about him staying away from the operational inbox. But Walter had founded Dunmore Infrastructure Partners in 1987, and there were still evenings when he opened the ministry distribution feed from the study of his home in Ancaster the way other men of his generation opened old blueprints. Not to work, but to remember what the work felt like. The safety concern report from the Burlington Meridian Center loaded at 7:46. Walter read the methodology section twice, tuned acoustic probe intervals calibrated to concrete cure age and aggregate composition, with resonance thresholds derived from a proprietary attenuation model. Not a general method, not something taught in any engineering curriculum he was aware of. A specific approach with a specific theoretical framework that he had encountered once before, handwritten in a spiral-bound notebook. On a Thursday afternoon 12 years earlier. The engineer who had brought that notebook to his attention had been a contract hire. His name on the safety report was Mitch Callender. Walter set his reading glasses on the side table and called Patricia Yoon before the thought had fully resolved itself into words. Patricia Yoon had been Walter's personal legal counsel for 9 years, a detail that mattered because it meant she was retained under his individual authority rather than through the company's legal department, which reported to Craig Pelletier, Dunmore's VP of Engineering, and which had been in Craig's orbit for most of the decade. Patricia specialized in intellectual property and contract disputes, and she had spent 8 months, quietly and without Craig's knowledge, reviewing an anomaly Walter had surfaced during a routine portfolio review. A patent on an acoustic resonance methodology filed 12 years earlier under the company's name. The technical specification was thorough enough that a layperson would have seen a document. Patricia had seen a document where the underlying mathematics arrived fully formed, without the developmental draft stages that appeared in every other technical filing in the company's archive. She had been looking for the source of that mathematics for 8 months. She had just found him. Walter arrived at the Barton Street office the following morning at 8:15. He came with Patricia beside him and a bank draft in the breast pocket of his coat that he had authorized the previous night from his personal account, pending final calculation from Patricia's audit. The figure represented 12 years of estimated royalties on a methodology that had been incorporated into every major infrastructure assessment contract Dunmore had signed since its 3rd year of operation, plus interest, plus the regulatory penalties that applied when a patent filing misrepresented the origin of the underlying work. Patricia had calculated it conservatively. The number was $16,800,000. Paige Dunmore was in the car with her father before it reached the highway. She had been awake since before 5, working through arguments she intended to make against what she was watching him prepare to do. The draft was not company money. It was her father's personal capital. That distinction mattered to her more than she had time to fully articulate. So did the fact that the man they were driving to see had spent the previous day filing a safety complaint against one of their projects and had left their offices without paying for access he had not been granted. Mitch was already at his desk when they arrived, a coffee going cold beside his keyboard and a set of acoustic probe calibration logs open on his screen. He looked at Walter Dunmore for a moment, then at Patricia, then at Paige, who was standing slightly behind her father and looking at the filing wall the way a person looks at something they have been trying to understand for a long time. Walter placed the bank draft on the desk without ceremony. He told Mitch that he was sorry it had taken this long to find him and that the figure had been calculated and verified and was his without condition. Mitch looked at the draft for a measured moment. The question he asked was not about the money. He asked how many active contracts were currently using his methodology. Walter looked at Patricia. Patricia told him 47 provincial infrastructure assessment contracts across Ontario and Alberta, with a combined contract value the audit had placed at $214 million over the 12-year period. Mitch absorbed that figure the way a person receives news that confirms something half-known for a long time. Without shock, but with a weight that changed the composition of the room. He asked to see the patent filing, the technical specification as submitted, and the chain of ownership documentation. Patricia opened her briefcase and placed a bound summary on the desk. She walked him through it line by line. She told him the payment was fully substantiated and came with no non-disclosure condition attached. She also told him, more carefully, that there was a settlement acknowledgement form he would need to review, that it would confirm the financial calculation as satisfying the outstanding royalty obligation, and that it did not extinguish any other claim. Mitch read the form. He set it beside the draft without picking up a pen. His objection was stated without heat. The form acknowledged the financial calculation, but contained no language requiring the restoration of his name on the patent record, and it contained no provision requiring a safety evaluation of every infrastructure assessment conducted under the version of his methodology currently in use, a version that, based on the technical specification he had just read, was missing a critical calibrate step in the attenuation model that made it accurate in standard conditions and unreliable under the combined stress of below-freezing temperatures and sustained dynamic load. The page said that he was attaching conditions to a settlement that had arrived without request, and that, withholding his signature on a financial acknowledgement for a payment he had just been handed, was not a negotiating position she intended to treat seriously. Mitch looked at her with the attention of a man who is trying to understand something rather than argue against it. He told her plainly, if the money were his primary concern, the form would already be signed. What concerned him was that the methodology in active use across 47 provincial contracts had been simplified at a stage he had not been part of, and that the simplification had removed a temperature compensation variable that was not optional. It was the variable that made the probe readings accurate below -12 Celsius. Most of those contracts covered bridges, parking structures, and transit infrastructure in Ontario. Ontario had winters. Walter looked at his daughter for a long moment and said that the assessment contracts should be paused, pending an independent methodology review. Page said that the contracts were tied to provincial deadline schedules and that pausing them would require explanations to the ministry that the company was not in a position to give on 48 hours' notice. Craig Pelletier had arrived at the Barton Street office ahead of the Dunmores, though no one in the room knew this yet. He had been sitting in a car across the street since 7:50, watching through the windshield, and when Paige stepped out briefly to take a call, Craig fell into step beside her on the sidewalk and told her, in a measured tone, that she should be aware Mitch Callender had been terminated from his Dunmore contract 12 years ago for removing proprietary technical files from the engineering lab, and that the methodology he was now claiming as his own was the precise methodology. He had been dismissed for allegedly stealing. Paige went still. She asked Craig when he had intended to mention this. Craig said he had been hoping it would not become relevant. The personnel file arrived the following afternoon. A physical folder which Craig delivered in person, carrying the implicit authority of a document too old to be digital. The termination summary described Mitch Callender as a contract engineer dismissed for cause following an investigation into the unauthorized removal of proprietary technical documentation. There was a facilities log showing Mitch had badged out of the engineering building after hours on a Tuesday. There was an incident summary prepared by Craig himself in his capacity at the time as project engineering supervisor. There was a legal hold notice, later closed without prosecution, a detail Craig described as the company's decision to extend professional courtesy to a young engineer in difficult personal circumstances rather than pursue a case that would follow him for the rest of his career. He told Paige privately that Walter was 71 years old, and that the past 2 years had made him susceptible to narratives offering a chance to correct an old wrong. He also told her that the audit Patricia Ewan had conducted had been authorized by Walter personally, outside board oversight, and that the methodology review Mitch was requesting would cost the company 6 weeks of delay on ministry schedules and an indeterminate amount in reputational exposure with provincial infrastructure clients. He asked her whether she was going to allow a former contractor, one terminated for cause, who had spent the previous day filing a complaint against a Dunmore inspection, to dictate the terms of a settlement her father had constructed unilaterally. Paige told him she was reviewing the full picture. It was not the answer he had come for. Mitch's version, delivered 2 evenings later in a meeting Patricia had arranged and Paige had attended because her father had asked her to, was different in every particular that mattered. He described the project he had been working on in his 3rd year on contract. A study of acoustic resonance patterns in post-tensioned concrete under thermal cycling conditions. He had identified a gap in the existing methodology. The probe attenuation model in standard use at the time did not account for aggregate composition variation in older concrete pours, which meant readings in pre-1980 infrastructure were systematically optimistic by a margin that mattered in freeze-thaw environments. He had spent 2 years and roughly $14,000 of his own money developing a corrected model in his basement workshop in Hamilton, working outside the company facility on purpose, because he had wanted the origin of the work to be unambiguous before he brought it forward. He had brought it to Craig Pelletier. Craig had asked to keep the notebook over a long weekend for review. When Mitch returned on Monday, Craig told him the engineering team had evaluated the concept and found it technically interesting but not sufficiently validated for commercial application. 4 weeks later, a patent application was filed under the company's name. It contained the corrected attenuation model, including the temperature compensation variable Mitch had derived. When Mitch returned to Craig with the patent filing, his building access was deactivated by end of business that same day. The termination letter arrived on Friday. He had not pursued legal action because 6 weeks after receiving that letter, his wife Yvonne had been diagnosed with advanced stage ovarian cancer. He had a daughter who was 5 years old, a treatment schedule that would consume everything he had, and a legal case against a capitalized firm that would take years and carry no guarantee of outcome. He had made the calculation that every parent eventually faces, and he had chosen the only thing he could not afford to lose. He had kept the original notebook. He acknowledged that 3 pages were missing, torn away in Craig's office when the notebook had been grabbed from his hands during the meeting that preceded his termination, and returned to him without them. Patricia asked to see the notebook. She turned through it slowly, studying the binding margins. Then she said that the patent application had been filed under Craig's supervisor authorization, and that the timestamp on the ownership transfer documentation placed the signing event on a date when Mitch's building access had already been deactivated. A person cannot sign a transfer agreement at a facility from which they have already been removed. Paige drove home alone and sat at her kitchen table with the audit summary and the patent filing side by side until well past midnight, reading every section in sequence rather than scanning for conclusions. She had built her management practice on trusting her engineering leadership to handle technical complexity so that she could manage client relationships and contract growth. What she was reading, page by page, was evidence that the person she had trusted most on the technical side had been structurally ensuring she never looked closely at the foundations of the methodology that represented 40% of the company's contract revenue. She was not fully certain Mitch's account of events 12 years earlier was accurate in every detail. But a timestamp was not a narrative. A timestamp did not have a perspective. The following morning, a version of events had reached 2 construction industry trade publications. The version described Mitch Callender as a disgruntled former contractor pursuing a decade-old grievance through an unsanctioned site inspection, now seeking a 7-figure payment for work already covered under a previous contract. The story cited no sources. It framed Mitch's presence in the conversation as an opportunistic intrusion at a commercially sensitive moment. 3 clients who had used Callender technical assessment for independent verification work called to pause their relationships pending clarification. A professional liability insurer sent a letter noting that the existence of unresolved litigation constituted a potential coverage concern and requesting a written response within 20 business days. None of these pressures were accidental, and Mitch understood their architecture clearly enough to know they had not originated with a journalist who had good sources. A separate contact arrived through a professional intermediary Mitch did not recognize, an informal offer, untraceably structured. The bank draft Walter had prepared would be delivered under a revised acknowledgement form with no conditions. The patent dispute would be settled outside the public record. No methodology review would be required. In exchange, Mitch would sign a comprehensive confidentiality agreement and would not seek to have his name attached to any filing or public record associated with the acoustic resonance methodology. Mitch forwarded the offer to Patricia and then called Bree. Bree was 17. She had been tracking the coverage from her phone at school, and her voice on the call had the particular steadiness of someone trying not to sound as frightened as she was. She asked if they were going to lose the firm. He told her honestly that it was possible, that the pressure being applied was real, that the insurance concern alone could disrupt work for months, and that he could stop all of it within 48 hours by signing a document he had already been offered. She asked why he hadn't signed it. He told her that the 47 contracts currently using the incomplete version of his methodology-covered infrastructure that would face the worst load and temperature conditions of the year between November and March. If he signed a confidentiality agreement while that remained true and something gave way on a bridge off the 401 in January, or in a parking structure in Winnipeg on a -20 afternoon, then he would have made a decision in this conversation that he could not afterward undo. Bree was quiet long enough that he thought the signal had dropped. Then she said, "Then don't sign it." It was more than he had expected from a 17-year-old who had already lost one parent, and it cost him something to hear it. Walter issued a public statement the following morning confirming that the payment under discussion originated from an independent audit, reflected a contractual obligation the company had failed to honor, and was unrelated to any current or pending litigation. The statement recalibrated the framing of the trade coverage without ending it. It removed the most damaging implication and forced the original framing to recalibrate. 3 days later, a file arrived in Mitch's email, a scanned image of 3 pages of graph-ruled notebook paper, the same stock as the notebook he already held, with the same mechanical pencil markings and the same margin annotations in his own handwriting. The temperature compensation derivation. The pages that had been torn from the notebook in Craig's office 12 years earlier and never returned. The email had no message. The sender address resolved to an account created 6 hours earlier and never used again. Patricia had the document authenticated independently. The scan metadata placed the original pages as photographed by a device registered to the company's internal network on a date from the original filing period. The physical pages once obtained matched the torn margins in Mitch's original notebook to within the tolerance of the paper fibers. 2 days after that, a letter reached the Barton Street office by ordinary post. It was from a man named Barry Greer, 63 years old. A former laboratory technician at Dunmore Infrastructure Partners, retired 4 years earlier and living in Sudbury. Barry wrote in careful block print that he had been in the room when the notebook was taken. He had watched Craig Pelletier remove 3 pages before returning the notebook to Mitch during the termination meeting. He had said nothing at the time because he had a mortgage, a daughter finishing her undergraduate degree, and because he had told himself for 12 years that the technical record would eventually surface on its own without requiring the cost of his becoming involved. He wrote that watching Mitch's name described as a bad faith opportunist in industry publications had made it impossible to sustain that argument any longer. Barry also told Mitch where the pages had gone. Craig had placed them inside a closed project archive, a discontinued feasibility study from the mid-2000s, whose physical records had been boxed and stored in an off-site facility in Guelph. The kind of record that no search using Mitch's name or the acoustic resonance patent as a reference term would ever reach. Page drove to the Guelph facility on a Thursday afternoon, presented her authorization as COO, and retrieved the box herself. The pages were inside, under a folder labeled with a project code that had been retired 9 years earlier. The handwriting was Mitch's. The dates at the top of each entry placed the temperature compensation derivation 14 months before Mitch had signed his first contract with Dunmore Infrastructure Partners. The work had existed before the contract. It had never been transferred. It had only been taken. Page arranged the technical evaluation herself through the Ministry of Transportation's Independent Compliance Office rather than through her company's internal channels. She invited 4 parties who had not previously been in a room together: the ministry's structural safety inspector for the Central Ontario region, the lead engineer from the provincial oversight auditing firm, Barry Greer, and Mitch Callender. She told Craig only that she was conducting a mandatory methodology verification review, which was accurate and which was the kind of statement that could not be objected to without creating a written record of the objection. The evaluation took place at a provincial test facility in Mississauga. Mitch arrived with a set of his original acoustic probes and a single printed page listing the calibration parameters his full methodology required. The testing team assigned to the review extended him the careful skepticism that specialists extend to outside parties until an outside party demonstrates they are not one. He identified a calibration gap in the first 30 minutes. The version of his methodology in active use, deployed across 47 contracts, had removed the temperature compensation variable from the probe calibration sequence. In its place, a fixed attenuation constant had been applied, drawn from average condition readings rather than from the reactive model Mitch had derived. The fixed constant performed correctly between 0 and 10 degrees Celsius. Below -10, the probe readings were optimistic by a margin that increased as temperature dropped. The ministry's structural safety inspector asked what that margin meant in practice. Mitch wrote 3 numbers on the whiteboard, the load threshold at which a delamination fault of the type he had identified in the Burlington columns became structurally critical, the temperature at which the fixed attenuation constant began producing incorrect readings, and the number of the 47 active contracts that involved infrastructure rated for the combined on-fault load and temperature conditions that made the error consequential. That number was 19. The inspector asked to see the full site list. Craig Pelletier, who had positioned himself near the back wall at an angle that made direct eye contact difficult, said that the methodology had been validated through the standard internal review process and that any suggestion of systematic inaccuracy would require the same independent confirmation process as the original patent claim. He said the review was being conducted under conditions not equivalent to real-world assessment environments, and that the results should be understood accordingly. The ministry inspector said he appreciated that perspective and asked for the site list a second time. Craig said that Page, as COO, had signed off on the methodology as validated for the contracted scope. Page said she had signed off on a summary document describing the methodology as having passed internal testing. She had not reviewed the calibration parameters because the summary had not included them. This was accurate. It was also a description of how a technical decision had been presented to an executive in a format designed to minimize the likelihood of scrutiny. She said so plainly, She did not offer Craig's conduct as a justification for her own failure to look more closely at what she had been given to sign. Mitch waited until she finished. He said, without directing the comment at anyone in particular, that the difference between a mistake made in negligence and a decision made in deliberate bad faith was primarily a question of what a person chose to do after the mistake became clear. He had watched Paige work through this for 3 weeks. What he had watched her do was stop a series of things that were in motion and look at what was underneath them, at significant cost to herself, when she had not been required to. That mattered, not as an erasure of what had come before it, but as evidence of the quality a leader most needed when the stakes were real. The formal process that followed moved through the ministry's compliance office and Dunmore's legal department simultaneously. Craig Pelletier's operational access was suspended within 48 hours of the evaluation. His credentials were deactivated at end of business the same day, a detail that produced a symmetry Mitch noted when Patricia told him, though he said nothing aloud. The Dunmore Infrastructure Board met twice, once to determine the company's liability exposure and once to determine whether Paige Dunmore would retain the role she had held for 6 years. Several members argued that her failure to identify Craig's conduct over the full duration of his tenure represented a governance failure too significant for structural remediation. Others argued that her response, halting contracts, authorizing the independent evaluation, accepting public accountability before a ministry inspector, was precisely the disposition they needed to preserve in their leadership. Walter Dunmore spoke once during the session. He said that Paige had made the right choice at the moment when the cost of making it was most visible to her, and that he intended to vote accordingly. The vote was 6-3. The settlement agreement took 9 days to draft and 5 more for Mitch to review with a lawyer he retained independently, from a firm with no prior connection to any party in the room. The final document contained 3 conditions, each of which had to be satisfied before the financial settlement would be considered complete. The first, formal restoration of his name as originating author on the acoustic resonance patent and all derivative applications, with an amended filing submitted to the Canadian Intellectual Property Office within 45 days. The second, a funded review and reassessment program covering all 19 high-risk infrastructure sites, conducted by a third-party engineering firm with no prior connection to Dunmore Infrastructure Partners, completed before the end of October to provide full clearance before the winter load season. The third, the establishment of a technical ethics reporting mechanism, an independently governed channel through which engineers on contract or in salaried roles could escalate safety concerns directly to a provincial regulator without routing them through management hierarchy, funded by Dunmore at $2 million and administered through the ministry's compliance office. Walter signed as founding shareholder. Paige signed as chief executive officer. The figure on the bank draft was $16,800,000. Mitch used a portion of the settlement to clear the equipment loan, complete a long-deferred renovation to the Barton Street office, and establish what he incorporated as the Callender Standards Foundation, a small independent body offering third-party methodology verification for structural assessment firms across the country, staffed by engineers vetted for both technical precision and what the founding charter described as a documented commitment to accuracy over convenience. Barry Greer joined the foundation as a senior reviewer under an agreement requiring his prior testimony to be included in the public case record. He spent his first 2 months writing a case study that was adopted as required reading by the Professional Engineering Ethics curriculum at 2 Ontario universities. The Burlington Meridian Center columns were repaired over 6 weeks in September. The contractor who did the remediation work used Mitch's original attenuation model for post-repair verification, All 19 high-risk sites were cleared before the first hard frost arrived. Paige appeared at the Barton Street office on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, unannounced. She did not come to discuss the settlement or the ministry process or the board vote. She came because she had sent Mitch a brief email the week before, asking whether he would be willing to show her how acoustic resonance readings actually worked. Not the summary version she had been signing off on for years, but the underlying version, starting from the anomaly rather than the report. He said yes. He was a patient teacher. She paid attention in a way that cost her something, which was the only way it works. The amended patent certificate arrived on a Friday, framed at Bree's request. She read her father's name on the document for a long time before she spoke. She said that the $16 million had changed things in ways that still didn't feel entirely real to her, and she understood it mattered. But the name on that certificate, she told him, was the thing that had let him stand up straight, in a way she hadn't fully seen since before her mother died. Mitch looked at the certificate for a moment, then at his daughter, then out the office window at Barton Street, in the flat October light. The $275 invoice was still in his chest pocket, folded once, unpaid. He had decided sometime in the weeks between the evaluation and the settlement that it was worth more there than in any ledger. A receipt for the precise moment when a small, deliberate act of contempt had become the variable that brought the whole structure down. Some debts, it turned out, collected themselves.